Hey, screenwriters. So today I want to talk to you about an important decision that I made for 2020 that has already impacted my life in a very positive way. It's made me less stressed out. It's given me more time to work on the kind of scripts and kind of stories that I want to personally focus on in my career. And it's helped me establish some boundaries in my life that, quite frankly, I wasn't really cognizant of before. The thing that I decided not to do any longer for 2020 is to do spec scripts. So what is a spec script? How does it work? And why did I walk away from it for 2020? Let's get going. So what is a spec script? Technically, a spec script is anything that you write that is for free. Now, that's not the definition that I tend to use because I think that as a writer, you have to keep writing anyway. So for me, the definition of spec script is the script that you write for someone else for free, whether that's a director, an actor, or a producer. If you're not being compensated for your work by someone else, that is a spec script. A spec script, for the sake of this video and for the sake of this discussion, is writing that you do for someone else for free or as a deferred payment. So for me, writing spec scripts for producers and directors has been sort of a mixed bag. On one hand, I was able to network really well and build really deep industry connections. On the other hand, it sort of emotionally drained me. It creatively drained me. I found myself working on projects that I really wasn't that excited about. I find spec script writing becomes more of a chore than a joy. And writing should be a joy. You should enjoy writing screenplays. You should enjoy writing scripts. And the minute you're not enjoying doing that, I think that's where, for me anyway, my creativity started to fall apart. One of the big dynamics that I realized doing spec scripts over the last couple of years was the imbalance of power that existed, particularly between director and screenwriter. Directors and producers have no problem telling you what to put into your screenplay, telling you to change the third act, to change characters, to make very broad, very general changes to a screenplay, but then would firewall you from giving your feedback into a production. So would not ask you your opinion in terms of, well, who do you think should play this character? Or what do you think we should do in terms of cinematography? Or what kind of shooting style were you envisioning when you were writing the screenplay? And that firewall became problematic for me because as a screenwriter, especially when you're doing short films and you're doing spec shorts, the success of that project is everything in terms of the value you get out of it. Short scripts are rarely read. Agencies don't tend to look at them. Managers don't tend to look at them. They don't represent something that a studio, for example, or a writer's room would even consider to get you a job in the industry. It's a nice calling card if the film does well. So if your short film does well, at least you can stand there and say, hey, I wrote that. But if the short film falls apart, then suddenly you spent weeks, even months writing something and you've gotten literally nothing out of it, other than getting a generic credit. Now, before I talk you out of doing spec writing, I want to be fair with you because there are scenarios where I think you should consider doing spec work. And my experiences over the last couple of years have sort of allowed me to offer some advice that I think is really practical that you should consider when considering doing spec work. Consideration number one, who are the producers and or director that you're going to be working with? If they have a long track record, if they are people that you look at and go, wow, they've actually done some stuff, or I really love their work, in that particular case, I think you should strongly consider doing spec work for them. I've worked with some producers and done some spec work, and it actually is leading to paid gigs. It hasn't led to it yet, full disclosure, but it's well along the way in terms of actually getting development funds for some pretty significant projects that you may actually be seeing in the theater in the next couple of years. And I would not have been able to build that relationship if I had not done spec work for them earlier. If the people who are asking you to do spec work are people whose work you really admire, are people that you can see maybe on a trajectory to Hollywood, maybe on a trajectory to success, then definitely consider doing it because it may absolutely be worth the time and the effort for you to write that script for them, for the recognition and the reputation building that would happen within that circle for you. Consideration number 2, do you own the work? Now, this is a big one, in particular when you're working, I think, with more of a writer-director partnership. So if you're working with a director, or if you're working with someone who is heavily involved in the development of that script, in the story of that script, a question you have to ask yourself is, do you still control your work, or is it now co-owned? And for me, this is a huge deal breaker when it comes to writing spec work. I don't mind writing something if at the end of the day it doesn't get produced, I still retain full control over it. I have a huge problem with spending time and effort developing something where the IP that is created is now co-owned, so I don't even have exclusive control over it. So it's not like I spent 6 months developing something, that project fell through, I can still take that script, sell it over here, develop it over there. If the IP is now co-owned between you and someone else, your ability to do anything becomes severely limited, because your ability to do something now runs into conflict potentially with what they want to do. That tension is significant, because if that's not resolved early, if you don't clearly define who owns that IP at the end of the day, your ability to get rewards back for all the time and effort you spent writing that screenplay is now severely hampered. So again, a big consideration: who owns the final product? I mean the final script, if it doesn't go into development. If you control it 100%, then it's something to consider in terms of the pros of doing a spec script. If you don't control it 100%, that's definitely a con, and something that should make you think twice before getting into a spec relationship with that particular director, producer, or actor. Consideration number 3, are you financially able to devote time and effort to spec writing? Screenwriting takes a long time, whether it's a short script or it's a feature script. It takes time, it takes hours, it takes weeks, it takes days, it takes months sometimes to come up with a great screenplay. Can you afford to spend that time writing, or do you need to spend that time looking for work or going to work? If you're financially strapped, if you are in the midst of looking for work, are you able to financially take on the burden of writing a spec script, of meeting deadlines, of going to meetings, of creative collaboration, of rewrites, of all the things that goes into creating a good script? Can you literally afford the time? If the answer is yes, again, that's a pro for you to do a spec script. If the answer is no, then I would recommend not doing it, because the last thing you want to do is put yourself under financial pressure just to write a spec script that may not get produced at the end of the day, when you could have saved yourself all of that grief and just been honest to yourself and to your production partner and saying, look, I just can't afford to do a spec script right now. Maybe once my work situation evens out, maybe once I get some money in the bank, maybe once I get some breathing room, I'll be able to explore this relationship again. But for right now, I can't. There's no shame in admitting that. There's no shame in saying, guys, I can't devote 6 months to write a feature for you. I have other things I have to do. If you can work out a relationship or an understanding where your financial well-being is a priority to you, and they understand that, again, that's a pro. That's something to consider in terms of that spec relationship. But your financial health and well-being is an important factor, especially if you're working for free on a spec. So it's a consideration, and you should take it seriously, and you shouldn't dismiss it. Just because you're an artist doesn't mean you have to be a starving artist. Those two things don't necessarily go together, and a lot of times they go together by choice when they don't have to. Consideration number 4, and this is a big one. Have you collaborated on a script with someone in the past? I was a solitary writer for most of my life, so I never co-wrote anything with anybody. So the process of writing with other people was a new experience for me, and admittedly, not an entirely positive one, if I have to be honest. And then on top of that, when someone else is giving you very, very specific notes, in some cases literally writing on top of your own words and saying, I'd rather the dialogue be like this, and literally write that dialogue out. For me, that never sat very well. It took me a long time to become comfortable with that. For you, it may come very easy, or it may not. So if you've never written a script in a collaborative environment before, you should really consider that as a variable as to whether or not you want to do spec work. If the writing you've done in the past has been more solitary, and that's when you produce the best work, then maybe that's just how you write. Maybe you're someone who says, look, I'm going to go off and write it, hand it off to you, and it's basically a take it or leave it scenario. If the version that I give you is in the end zone, if it's close to exactly where you want it to be, then great. If it's not, I don't want a whole lot of back and forth because I think that version of that script is great. So if you're going to be involved in constant rewrites, if that's going to be a problem for you, then spec script writing may not be the best path forward for your creative goals. If you are happy with getting feedback and doing rewrites in a collaborative writing environment, then absolutely spec scripts are something you should consider doing because there's plenty of opportunity to do that in a spec script environment. And finally, consideration number 5. Can you shoot this yourself? I mentioned this earlier in particular regarding short films, that short films don't do much for a screenwriter's career. They do a lot for directors, for cinematographers, for actors, but for whatever reason, that simply has not translated well to screenwriters. I have seen directors go from directing a short film to directing television and even directing a feature. I have seen actors go from acting in a short film to acting in television and acting in a feature. But I have never seen, or I have rarely seen, a screenwriter go from writing a short film to writing on television and writing for film. So it begs the question, does it make sense for you to go out and shoot your spec your own? Does it make sense for you to take full creative control of your work and say, rather than working with someone else to get a short film done, rather than me having to collaborate and potentially dilute my creative vision for the story, does it simply make sense for me to go out and shoot it on my own, have full creative control, be the director, and then I may end up with something that can help launch not just my writing career, but my directing career as well. Given how cheap it is now to shoot films, given how accessible and democratized filmmaking equipment and filmmaking technology has become, it makes a lot of sense for you to go out and shoot your own stuff. It makes a lot of sense for you as a screenwriter to get behind the camera and say, I've written a bunch of short films, I'm going to go out and direct a bunch of short films. It is entirely possible for you to go out and shoot a spectacular short film on your iPhone, on a off-the-shelf DSLR, in ways that just didn't exist a decade ago. I have to empower myself as a screenwriter to have full control over my words. And the only way I will ever get full control over the words on the page that I've written is to get behind the camera. So again, guys, my advice is, for me, I'm done with spec work for other people for 2020. But that doesn't mean that it should be the same way for you. For me, I think for 2020, screenwriters should be retaining as much power as possible over their words and over their work. If the way you go about doing that is collaborating via a spec model, I think that's awesome. If it works for you, more power to you. On the other hand, if you're empowered to go out and shoot your own thing, I can't wait to see it, because I think we need more writer-directors out there. So that's it. That's my video. If you have any comments, if you have any questions, drop them in the box below. Happy writing.